The morning light spread gently across the wooden stilt house, soft rays slipping through the gaps between the planks as the sound of birds echoed from the mountains, creating a quiet, peaceful start to the day that felt almost untouched by the struggles of the world beyond. Jack sat cross-legged on the small wooden floor outside the house, holding a simple bowl of breakfast in his hands, steam rising slowly into the cool air. Across from him, Tử Tiên leaned slightly forward, her eyes calm but thoughtful, as if something had been on her mind long before this morning. For a while they ate in silence, not uncomfortable, just familiar. Until, "Jack?" Her voice was soft, but it carried weight. Jack looked up immediately. She hesitated for a brief second, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of her bowl, then finally met his eyes. "I want to ask you something." Jack smiled faintly. "You don't need to ask like that. Just say it." She exhaled quietly. Then, "Can you teach the children here how to read?" The words landed gently, but they didn't feel small. Jack blinked. "Teach?" Tử Tiên nodded. Her eyes shifted slightly toward the distant hills. "The school is very far from here," she explained. "Some of the children, they've never even been there." Jack's expression slowly changed, from curiosity to something deeper. "They want to learn," she continued, "but they can't go. Their families are poor, they need to help at home." Her voice didn't break, but there was something inside it. Something quiet, heavy. "I was thinking," she added softly, "maybe you could help them." Silence. The kind that makes time slow down. Jack lowered his gaze slightly, his mind drifting back to a different life. A life where education was something everyone had, where knowledge was expected, where he never had to think twice about learning, reading, understanding. And now here, there were children who didn't even have that chance. Jack's fingers tightened slightly around the bowl. "Do you think I can?" he asked quietly. Tử Tiên looked at him immediately. "Yes. No hesitation." No doubt. That answer hit harder than anything else, because she didn't see his past, his money, his status. She saw him, and believed in him. Jack exhaled slowly, then nodded. "All right." Tử Tien's eyes widened slightly. "Really?" A small smile appeared on his face. "Yeah," he said. "Let's do it." And just like that, something new began. The two of them walked down the village path together shortly after, the sun now rising higher, warming the ground beneath their feet. As they made their way toward the house of the village chief, their steps steady, their purpose clear. When they arrived, the Trongban was sitting outside, sipping tea. His posture relaxed but his eyes observant as always. "Jack," he greeted with a nod. "Tử Tiên." Jack stepped forward respectfully. "We came to ask for your help," he said. The man raised an eyebrow slightly. "What kind of help?" Jack glanced at Tử Tiên briefly, then continued. "We want to teach the children in the village, reading and writing." A pause. The Trongban leaned back slightly, considering. "Here?" he asked. Jack nodded. "If possible, we'd like to use the community house." Silence settled for a moment, not tense, but thoughtful. The Trongban looked at both of them carefully. At Jack, the outsider who stayed. At Tử Tiên, the girl who never left. Then he nodded. "You can use it."
Tu tiens face-li up instant-li.
"Thank you." Jack bowed his head slightly. "We won't waste the opportunity." The Trongban gave a small smile. "I know." The community house had been unused for a long time. Dust covered the floor. Cobwebs hung in the corners. The wooden boards creaked with every step. But Jack stood in the middle of the room, looking around not with disappointment, but with vision. "We can fix this," he said. Tử Tiên nodded immediately. "Yes." And without waiting, they started. Jack grabbed a broom and began sweeping the floor, dust rising into the air as he moved steadily from one corner to another, his shirt quickly becoming dirty, his hands roughened, but he didn't stop. He wiped the tables, fixed the broken legs of old chairs, dragged wooden desks into rows, step by step, turning something abandoned into something meaningful. Meanwhile, Tử Tiên ran from house to house, calling out, "Come to the community house. Jack will teach you. You can learn to read." At first, the children hesitated, shy, uncertain. But curiosity grew, then excitement. One by one, they came. Small footsteps running along dirt paths. Bright eyes filled with something they rarely had, hope. By the time Jack stepped back and looked at the room again, it was no longer empty. It was full. Children filled every corner, sitting on benches on the floor, close together, whispering, giggling, waiting for him. Jack paused at the doorway for a second, taking it in, because this was nothing like boardrooms, nothing like meetings, nothing like the life he left behind, and yet, it felt more important than anything he had ever done. He stepped inside. The room quieted instantly. All eyes on him. Jack picked up a piece of chalk, turned toward the wooden board he had just hung up, and slowly wrote the first letter. The sound of chalk against wood echoed softly. "Today," he said, turning back to them, a small smile forming. "We start from the beginning." Outside, Tử Tiên stood quietly by the door, watching, her eyes warm, her heart full, because in that moment, she didn't just see Jack teaching. She saw him becoming something more, something real, something that truly belonged there. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't feel uncertain, felt possible. The sound of children repeating letters filled the small community house, uneven at first, hesitant, some voices too soft, some too loud, but all of them trying, all of them reaching towards something they had never truly held before. And Jack stood there in front of them, chalk still in his hand, watching not just their mouths forming words, but their eyes lighting up with understanding, curiosity, and something deeper that he hadn't seen in a very long time. "Again," he said gently. The children straightened slightly. They echoed louder this time. Jack nodded. "Good. Now B. A few of them laughed after shouting too loudly, covering their mouths shyly, while others leaned forward, eager, as if afraid they might miss even a single moment of this. Jack smiled. Not the polite smile he used to give in meetings, not the controlled one, but something real, something that came from seeing change happen right in front of him. He walked between the rows slowly, crouching down beside a small boy who was gripping a piece of chalk too tightly, his fingers white with effort. "Relax your hand," Jack said softly, guiding him. "Like this." The boy looked up, nervous, then tried again. The line was crooked, uneven, but it was there. Jack nodded. "That's it." The boy's face lit up instantly. A small success, but it meant everything. Across the room, a little girl struggled to follow, her brows furrowed as she stared at the board, trying to connect the sounds with the shapes, her lips moving silently as she repeated the letters to herself over and over again. Jack noticed. He walked over, knelt beside her. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lynn," she whispered. "All right, Lynn," Jack said, picking up another piece of chalk. "Let's do it together." He drew slowly, clear, simple, then handed her the chalk. She hesitated, then followed, line by line, careful, focused. And when she finished, she looked up at him, waiting. Jack smiled. "You did it." Her eyes widened, and just like that, confidence appeared. Outside, Tử Tiên leaned lightly against the wooden pillar, watching everything in silence, her eyes moving from child to child, then back to Jack, her lips curving slightly as she saw how naturally he fit into this role. How patient he was, how calm, how different from the man who once stood in a world far removed from this one. She didn't interrupt, didn't step in. She just stayed there, because this moment belonged to him. Time passed without anyone noticing. The sun climbed higher. The light shifted. But inside the room, nothing mattered except the sound of learning, of voices growing stronger, of small hands raising. "Say, Jack," one boy suddenly called out. Jack turned. "Yes. How do you write my name?" A few others immediately leaned in. "Mine too." "And mine." Jack chuckled softly. "All right, one at a time." The room filled with energy, with excitement, with something alive. And for a brief moment, everything else disappeared. The past, the struggles, the conflicts, even a pow, even his mother. All of it faded. Because here, right now, this mattered more. But outside, not everything was as peaceful. At the edge of the path, partially hidden behind a tree, a figure stood still, watching the scene from afar, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Uppo. His eyes narrowed slightly as he listened to the laughter, the voices, the sound of Jack teaching, the children gathering around him like he belonged there. That was the part he couldn't accept. Not the stall, not the arguments, but this connection, this respect, this place Jack was slowly taking.
아빠와 zgotaitant.
They really think he's one of them now, he muttered under his breath. His gaze shifted toward 210, standing there, watching Jack, smiling. That smile, it stayed with him, longer than anything else. His fingers curled slightly, then slowly he turned and walked away, but not with the same arrogance as before. This time, there was something else, something quieter, more dangerous. Inside, Jack finished writing another name on the board, stepping back as the children clapped softly, some out of excitement, some just because others were doing it. But the joy in the room was undeniable. He looked at them, at each face, each pair of eyes, and for the first time in his life, he felt something he never expected. Not success, not power, but purpose. Tomorrow, he said, his voice steady, we'll learn more. A small cheer went up. Really? You'll come again?
Thầy Jack không đi đâu chứ?
Jack paused, just for a second, then nodded. I'm not going anywhere. The answer was simple, but it carried weight, because it wasn't just for them, it was for himself. The children slowly began to leave one by one, turning back again and again as if afraid the moment would disappear if they didn't look at it enough times, until finally the room grew quiet again, the echoes of laughter fading into the distance. Jack stood alone in the middle for a moment, then turned. Tutien was still there, waiting. Their eyes met. No words, but everything was understood. You did well, she said softly. Jack shook his head slightly. They did. She smiled. Still, I'm proud of you. That made him pause, because those words meant more than any achievement he had ever received. They walked back together slowly as the afternoon light softened around them, the path familiar, the silence comfortable, but beneath it, there was something new, a future they hadn't planned, but had just begun. Behind them, the community house stood quietly again. Simple, old, but no longer empty, because what had started there today was bigger than both of them, and somewhere in the distance, a storm was still forming, unseen, unheard, waiting, because when something good begins, there are always forces that try to break it. And whether Jack and Tutien could protect this small light they had just created was a story still waiting to unfold.